Grandpa, I really love playing basketball with you.
Well, I love playing with you and Ty as well, Peyton.
Isn't this a great place to play, Grandpa?
Yes, Ty, but it wasn't always like this.
Well, with the exception of Vancouver, who had built community centers and had a series of professional staff employed, most recreation departments up to the 1957, 58s were playgrounds and swimming pools.
Ken, you are so right. The difference between 1958 and now in the recreation and park sector is hard to imagine. Welcome. Over the next 7 or 8 minutes, we're going to examine not only 50 years of the BCRPA, we're also going to reach back to the beginning of the last century to show you where the sector started, why and how the BCRA and eventually the BCRPA got going, the amazing challenges since the association was formed, where we are now, and where we're headed. So let's go back in time. Mae Brown joins us now to give us some insight into why recreation programs got started in the first place. Mae?
Well, I think the general feeling was that if you created some open space where children could gather, it would keep them away from the evils of society. And it proved to be successful because, of course, this was all started in the urban cities of Europe and Eastern Canada, where we had major cities. And I think the open space and the idea of a playground was what attracted people.
Not so much about personal development, but more about social good then?
That's right. They weren't thinking so much about the individual as they were about keeping these youngsters off the street, as it was quoted, and keeping them out of mischief and building a better community.
Norma Lennox, is that your understanding of the early motivation behind recreation?
Yeah, no question about it. And of course, this was in concert with the Boys and Girls Clubs, boys clubs in those days, YMCAs, YWCAs in those days, churches. In fact, in Vancouver, I believe, as I recall, as a participant, Chown Church used to have an indoor swimming pool and used to foster basketball, boys basketball teams. So we had a whole host of other agencies involved in recreation. But as municipalities grew, they began to take on the greater responsibility of something for everyone.
In fact, in the early days, the development of playgrounds happened in part thanks to the generosity of others. You're looking at a modern image of Sepperley Park and Stanley Park. It was the very first playground in Canada, and it was donated to the city by the heiress to a lumber fortune. Let's fast forward a bit now to the 19-teens leading up to the First World War. At the time, a number of new parks were being built. Mae, I'd like to ask you, what was the reason the new parks were being developed?
They were largely parade grounds for the military, and even the people in the reserves, of course, had to go and march and in formation on those open spaces. So the motivation of getting more space was very much the military.
Of course, during the war and in the years after, the sector fell off the federal and provincial government's agenda. Locally, there was a focus on the development of playgrounds and, of course, swimming. Right now we're looking at some pictures that came to us courtesy of the Vancouver Parks Board. As you can see, swimming made up so much of what the sector had to offer at the time. But then, as the Depression took hold, the federal government once again turned to recreation to help address a need. Mae?
Yes, as a result of the Depression, where there were a lot of unemployment and a lot of youth around who, as they said, didn't idle hands, you know, and the government, I think quite wisely, started a very, very good program called Provincial Recreation, ProRec. Now their main emphasis was train the leaders who could go out to every little community in British Columbia, involve the young people, get them physically fit, and keep them busy.
Now, let's jump forward to the 1950s. The economy started to heat up. Local governments started to get involved in the development of recreation facilities like arenas. Most were named memorial facilities in honor of those who had lost their lives in the war. Then, as baby boomers first started to arrive, there was a shift in the approach governments took when it came to recreation.
Well, I think the governments in the 50s had to respond to the broader needs of the family, as you say, with the baby boomers, and with communities developing at that time. They had to build in facilities and amenities for the quality of life for the families living in those neighborhoods.
At the time, most of the people hired to take on recreational roles were ex-military. It was about the only training available. Then in 1957, the National Recreation Association, an American organization, held its annual conference in Vancouver. Out of that meeting, a committee was created to look into establishing a recreation association in BC. Don Cunnings, you were there. What was it like?
Well, it was very edifying in that the National Recreation Association Pacific Northwest region was convening at the Georgia Hotel. I'm not sure, it was either 56 or 57, but that organization encompassed 3 Western Canadian provinces. It was Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, but we did not have an association per se in British Columbia. So we were marveling at their organization at that point and thought we could benefit collectively by having one voice in British Columbia as a conduit possibly to speak to the Minister of Municipal Affairs, the Minister of Education, or the Premier himself.
And in May of 1958, in Vernon, the first BC Recreation Association meeting was held. And as Don mentioned, the sector now had a provincial voice. The timing was perfect. The sector was about to go through tremendous growth. Don, as we know, the needs of young families were a motivating factor, and that's when the governments of the day started to invest in facilities.
It certainly impacted it, but the real impactor for facilities, because that's what really drove this, was the myriad of centennials, starting with the 58 centennial, because there were shared dollars from the province and from the feds. And circa 1958, there was also what we called the Federal Winter Works Program, which was 1/3 dollars from federal, 1/3 province, and 1/3 for municipalities. So there was arenas popping up all over the place, ice arenas, and curling rinks, which back then you could build a 6-seat curling rink and a 1,500-seat arena for $525,000. So on a 1/3 basis, it wasn't a Herculean fiscal goal to achieve.
Thanks, Don.